Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the medieval world, a place of stone walls, flickering candles, and decisions that quite sincerely almost wiped people out. So settle in, lower the lights, let the room go quiet. If you enjoy long, boring history that gently escorts your brain toward sleep, remember to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me which medieval disaster you accidentally survived just by being born centuries later. Alright, let's begin. Medieval Europe had many talents: architecture, calligraphy, pointed shoes that looked deeply impractical. What it did not have was a strong grasp on cause and effect. And so, again and again, medieval societies wandered confidently toward extinction, not with malice, but with enthusiasm, with rules, with prayers, and with an unwavering belief that if something felt righteous enough, it probably wouldn't kill everyone. It very nearly did. Let's start, gently, with blood, because medieval people were absolutely obsessed with getting rid of it. Bloodletting was medicine's favorite hobby. Feeling tired, bloodletting. Feeling sad, bloodletting. Feeling perfectly fine, bloodletting just to be safe. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. The body had humors. Too much of one humor meant imbalance, and imbalance meant illness. So naturally, the solution was to drain a patient until they looked like a damp bedsheet. Kings did this too, frequently, especially kings who were already sickly, malnourished, and genetically fragile from generations of strategic cousin selection. One French king, Louis VIII, was bled so aggressively during illness that modern historians quietly agree he was essentially medically assisted into the afterlife. The doctors meant well, they always did. They just believed the human body was like a badly tuned lute. Pull a string hard enough, and eventually the noise stops. In some regions, entire communities followed seasonal bloodletting schedules, everyone, at once, before epidemics, during epidemics, after epidemics. If anyone was still upright, it did not prevent disease. It did, however, ensure that when disease arrived, everyone was already weak, dizzy, and extremely bleedable. A promising strategy, if extinction was the goal. Now let's drift over to food, or more specifically, the suspicious hatred of it. Medieval Europe was deeply wary of vegetables. Not all vegetables, just the ones that grew underground. Turnips, onions, garlic, carrots. These were believed to absorb sinful vapors from hell, naturally, because they were close to the devil, who lived underground, like a root vegetable landlord. During plagues, people were advised to avoid these foods entirely, which was unfortunate, because they were often the only foods available. So instead, many communities chose refined diets of white bread, watered wine, and prayer. Lots of prayer. Almost no vitamins. Children raised on this diet developed deformities, blindness, and immune systems that surrendered immediately upon meeting reality. But medieval logic was firm. If the child was sick, it was not the diet. It was the carrots they didn't eat correctly. Or witches, usually witches. Speaking of which, let's glide quietly toward mass hysteria. When plague swept through Europe, killing millions, people searched for answers. The correct answer, germs, was unavailable. So medieval society selected the next best option: collective panic. Entire towns decided that God was angry, and the only way to fix this was to become more extreme, more restrictive, more violent. Flagellant movements became popular. Groups of men wandered from town to town, whipping themselves publicly. Blood everywhere. Repentance everywhere. Disease transmission absolutely thriving. They slept together. They bled together. They shared wounds. They shared germs. And then they shared death. Authorities initially allowed this, because it looked holy. Eventually, even the church had to admit it was not helping. But by then, the damage was done. Entire regions weakened themselves through ritualized self-harm during pandemics. A bold move. Now, let's drift into royal bedrooms, because that's where extinction nearly became official policy. Medieval elites married for power, not health. This meant repeated unions between close relatives, cousins, uncles and nieces, occasionally combinations that made even medieval priests pause briefly before approving. The result was bloodlines that folded inward like damp parchment. Take the Habsburgs, notorious, glorious, and shaped like walking family trees with no branches. Generations of inbreeding produced jaws that barely functioned, immune systems that barely tried, and children who did not survive infancy at rates that should have prompted concern. Instead, it prompted more marriage contracts. Royal families believed God favored them, so when their children died, it was mysterious, tragic, certainly not genetic arithmetic. Some dynasties lost so many heirs that entire kingdoms teetered on collapse. Civil wars followed, succession crises erupted, all because nobody wanted to marry someone from outside the family dinner table. But extinction wasn't just about genes, it was also about hygiene, or rather, the rejection of it. Bathing fell out of fashion in medieval Europe, partly because Roman baths were associated with decadence, partly because people believed warm water opened pores, and opened pores invited disease, like tiny doors for death. So people stopped bathing, kings included. Instead, they changed linen, sometimes, and applied perfume liberally, aggressively. Court life smelled like ambition and regret. Parasites flourished, lice, fleas, worms. These parasites carried disease, which people interpreted as divine punishment, which led to more prayer and less bathing. A beautiful cycle. Now, let's slide quietly into childbirth, because medieval childbirth was less a medical event and more a gamble with God. Women gave birth surrounded by superstition. Midwives did their best, armed with experience and prayers. Doctors were often worse. Male physicians entered birthing rooms rarely, and usually when things were already catastrophic. They brought instruments and confidence, neither of which improved outcomes. Royal women were expected to produce heirs quickly and repeatedly. Recovery time was considered optional. Many queens died young, not from poison, not from intrigue, just from doing exactly what was expected of them. Some dynasties lost so many mothers and infants that population replacement became difficult, yet the expectations never softened. If anything, they intensified. Let's pause gently on childhood. Medieval childhood was brief, painful, and statistically optimistic. Children were swaddled tightly, sometimes for months. Movement was discouraged. Crying was sinful. Curiosity was dangerous. Education, when it came, involved memorization and fear. Physical punishment was routine. Emotional warmth was considered indulgent. Many children didn't survive. Those who did often grew into adults, shaped by malnutrition, illness, and trauma. But society accepted this, because it had always been this way, which is medieval shorthand for "we will not be fixing this." And finally, let's drift toward medicine one last time. During outbreaks, cities sometimes sealed themselves completely. No movement, no trade, no food. Quarantines, in theory, saved lives. In practice, medieval execution often meant starving the healthy alongside the sick. In some cities, entire neighborhoods were boarded up, families inside, alive. This did reduce disease spread. It also reduced population, but officials could point to action, which mattered more than results. By the late medieval period, Europe had lost staggering numbers of people, not just to plague, but to its own responses: bloodletting, starvation, inbreeding, hygiene avoidance, spiritual panic, rigid tradition. Extinction was never the intention, but it hovered, always nearby, waiting politely. And yet, somehow, people endured, slowly, painfully, in ways that should not have worked. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the specific rulers, dynasties, and families who turned these bad ideas into inherited disastrous royal bloodlines, so fragile they could barely survive their own coronations. But for now, breathe slowly, let the candles dim, and remember, you survived the Middle Ages by not being in them. Alright, welcome back. Get comfortable again. If you nodded off for a moment, that's perfectly appropriate. Tonight, we're continuing our slow drift through medieval Europe, where crowns were heavy, bloodlines were thin, and survival often felt like an optional feature. In this part, we're going to linger on specific families, not heroes, not geniuses, but royal houses that quietly, methodically sabotaged their own future. Because when medieval people almost went extinct, the elites were often leading by example. Let's begin with the idea of royal blood. It was considered sacred, pure, different from everyone else's blood. This belief created a small problem. If royal blood was special, then mixing it with ordinary blood was dangerous, contaminating, unthinkable. So rulers married inward, again and again, and then once more, just to be certain no new genes snuck in uninvited. Over time, royal family trees stopped branching. They folded, they looped, they became decorative knots. Children were born sickly, small, prone to fevers that never quite left. Many did not survive infancy. This was tragic, of course, but not alarming enough to change policy. Instead, courts interpreted high infant mortality as God testing them, which meant the solution was more prayer and more of the same marriages. Let's drift to medieval Spain. Long before the famous Habsburg jaw became a punchline, Iberian royalty was already experimenting with aggressive cousin marriage. Political alliances mattered more than biology. Unifying kingdoms was worth a few malformed heirs, or many. Some kings produced dozens of children. Only a handful lived past childhood. Even fewer reached adulthood without chronic illness. This created a succession problem. When heirs died unexpectedly, kingdoms destabilized, civil wars erupted, foreign powers intervened. Entire populations suffered because one family refused to marry outside a very specific social circle. Naturally, nobody blamed genetics. They blamed God, or sin, or a servant who looked suspicious. Now let's glide north, toward France. French kings were an interesting mix of absolute authority and absolute physical fragility. Many were crowned young, ill-prepared, and already unhealthy. Louis X, for example, became king in his 20s and died shortly after, possibly from pneumonia, possibly from exhaustion, possibly from the accumulated stress of being raised like a decorative object instead of a human. His son lived only a few days. This was not unusual. Royal children were raised under intense pressure. They were isolated. Their diets were controlled. Their movements restricted. Fresh air was optional. Sunlight was suspicious. The goal was protection. The result was vulnerability. When illness arrived, and it always did, royal bodies had very little resilience. Now let's pause gently on medieval medicine again, because royal doctors deserve special attention. These men were highly educated, which meant they were extremely confident. They relied on ancient texts, mostly wrong ones. When a king fell ill, doctors often prescribed rest, prayer, and aggressive bloodletting, sometimes purging, sometimes both. Weak kings were made weaker. Feverish kings were drained. Dehydrated kings were bled. If the king died, it was God's will. If he lived, the doctors took credit. Either way, nobody adjusted the treatment. Now let's wander into England. The Plantagenet dynasty was powerful, ambitious, and deeply dysfunctional. They ruled for centuries. They also spent much of that time fighting each other. Inter-family conflict wasn't just political, it was personal. Brothers rebelled, sons imprisoned fathers, cousins arranged quiet disappearances. This constant stress took a toll. Royal men were expected to lead armies. Royal women were expected to produce heirs. Both roles were exhausting. Neither encouraged longevity. Henry VI is a particularly soft example. Gentle, passive, prone to mental collapse. He inherited the crown as a child and spent much of his reign confused, withdrawn, and overwhelmed. Modern historians suspect severe mental illness. At one point, he became completely unresponsive for months. A king in name only. The kingdom fractured round him. Civil war followed. When royal mental health collapsed, so did entire nations. But medieval society had no language for this. Mental illness was spiritual weakness, or possession, or simply ignored. And so fragile minds remained in power far longer than they should have. Now let's drift into the Holy Roman Empire, a place where titles multiplied faster than solutions. German princes married strategically, religiously, within narrow noble circles. The result was regional dynasties filled with children who did not thrive, small courts, high mortality, frequent extinctions of noble lines. When a ruling house died out, chaos followed. Territories were disputed, borders shifted, wars ignited. Extinction wasn't just biological, it was political. Entire noble families vanished within a few generations, their lands absorbed by others, their names forgotten, all because their bloodlines could not sustain themselves. Now let's rest briefly on queens. Medieval queens had one primary job: produce heirs, preferably male, preferably quickly. Pregnancy was constant, recovery was brief, medical care was minimal. Many queens experienced repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths. This wasn't interpreted as a health issue, it was a moral one. If a queen failed to produce sons, she was blamed. Not the king, not genetics, not the fact that they were second cousins with matching family portraits. Queens were isolated during pregnancy, surrounded by prayer and expectation. Some died young, some survived but were physically ruined. Royal lineage survived at the expense of royal women, and sometimes it didn't survive at all. Now let's drift toward the Black Death again, but from a royal perspective. When plague struck, nobility fled cities. They retreated to countryside estates. They isolated themselves. This worked, briefly, but plague followed trade routes, servants, supplies. Eventually, it reached everyone. Kings died, princes died, entire noble households vanished within weeks. In some regions, extinction was so complete that lands sat empty for years. This shook medieval confidence. If God favored the nobility, why were they dying too? The answer again was not science. It was increased religious intensity, which often meant stricter rules, harsher punishments, and fewer adaptive behaviors. Finally, let's touch gently on one more quiet threat: tradition. Medieval society prized continuity. Change was dangerous, innovation suspicious. Even when systems clearly failed, medically, politically, genetically, they were preserved, because they were familiar, and familiarity felt safer than uncertainty. This rigidity nearly ended entire dynasties, and sometimes did. But despite all this, people endured. Families adapted, slowly, reluctantly. New blood entered royal lines. Medicine improved eventually. Hygiene returned, quietly. Extinction stepped back, just a little. In the next part, we'll drift into the everyday medieval habits: diet, superstition, work, and belief that quietly weakened entire populations over centuries. Not dramatically, just steadily. For now, let your thoughts slow. Let the kings and queens fade into the dark, their crowns resting heavily beside them. Welcome back. Settle in again. If the room feels a little quieter now, that's exactly right. Tonight, we're drifting away from crowns and thrones and into something much more dangerous: daily life. Because medieval people didn't only flirt with extinction through kings and dynasties, they practiced it gently, every single day, through habits that felt normal, moral, and deeply sensible at the time. Let's begin with something very small: water. Medieval Europeans did not trust it. Running water was unpredictable, still water was suspicious, and clean water was theoretically nice, but rarely available. So instead, people drank ale, weak beer, daily beer, morning beer, because boiling killed some things, and fermentation felt safer than streams full of mystery. This worked, mostly, but it also meant chronic dehydration, nutritional imbalance, and widespread liver issues that nobody could name. Children drank beer, monks drank beer, pregnant women drank beer. Water existed, but it was treated like a reckless acquaintance who might stab you. Now let's drift into food again. Not scarcity, but belief. Medieval diets were ruled by theology. The church categorized foods as hot, cold, wet, or dry. Eating the wrong balance could cause illness, or lust, or melancholy, or spontaneous personality changes. Fish was holy, meat was dangerous, except when it wasn't. Vegetables were suspicious, except sometimes during fasting days, of which there were many people avoided animal products entirely. This included eggs, milk, cheese. So entire populations experienced frequent protein deficiency, regularly, as a religious practice. Children grew slowly, adults weakened, immune systems compromised. But fasting was virtuous, so weakness was spiritual success. If people died, they died pure. Now let's glide toward superstition. Because medieval Europe did not merely believe strange things, it organized society around them. Eclipses were omens, comets were warnings, unusual weather meant judgment. If crops failed, someone had sinned. If disease spread, someone was guilty. This thinking created a dangerous feedback loop. When something went wrong, people did not adapt. They searched for blame. Minorities suffered, women suffered, the poor suffered. Witch hunts were not just hysteria. They were population stress responses. Communities under pressure turned inward. They purged themselves, literally. Women, especially older women, were accused of poisoning wells, cursing children, ruining harvests. They were executed, often violently. This removed caregivers, midwives, healers, people with practical knowledge. So society lost its most useful members. During crises, a remarkable strategy. Now let's rest gently on housing. Medieval homes were dark, crowded, smoky. Fires burned constantly. Ventilation was minimal. People inhaled smoke from childhood. Chronic lung disease was common. Nobody noticed, because everyone coughed. Animals lived indoors. Chickens, goats, sometimes pigs. Parasites thrived. Zoonotic diseases spread quietly. Illness was constant, low-level, unrelenting. People didn't get sick suddenly, they just faded. Life expectancy hovered low, not because everyone dropped dead at 30, but because bodies wore out early. Now, let's drift into work. Medieval labor was physical, relentless, seasonal but unforgiving. Peasants worked long hours with inadequate nutrition. Injuries were untreated, infections common. A cut could kill you. A blister could end a career. When people couldn't work, they starved. There was no safety net, only community charity, which fluctuated with harvests and moods. This meant entire populations teetered constantly. One bad winter, one failed crop, one tax increase, and extinction brushed close again. Now let's slide toward religion, not belief, but enforcement. The church regulated behavior tightly. Sex, marriage, food, time, calendar life was crowded with obligations. Feast days, fast days, holy days. Productivity suffered, nutrition suffered. Rest was uneven, guilt was constant. People believed suffering was meaningful, so reducing suffering felt wrong. Pain purified, comfort corrupted. This mindset discouraged medical intervention. It discouraged reform. It encouraged endurance. Endurance is admirable, but it is not adaptive. Now let's drift toward plague again, but from the street level. When disease appeared, people did not isolate rationally. They isolated symbolically. Homes were marked, doors painted, entire families confined. Some fled, spreading disease further. Others stayed, praying harder. Cities rang bells constantly. Funeral bells, warning bells. The sound alone must have exhausted people. Mental health collapsed quietly. Grief piled up. Nobody processed it. Trauma became normal. This affected fertility. Birth rates dropped. Marriage delayed. Population recovery slowed. Extinction didn't arrive in a dramatic wave. It lingered. Now let's pause on hygiene one more time. People believed visible dirt was less dangerous than invisible forces, so cleaning focused on appearance, not sanitation. Hands were rarely washed. Tools were shared, food prepared communally. This spread disease efficiently, but disease was invisible, so it wasn't addressed. Instead, people burned herbs, hung charms, rang bells. These things smelled nice, which felt productive. Now let's talk about childhood again, but socially. Children were not sheltered. They worked early, witnessed death frequently. This matured them quickly, and traumatized them quietly. Play existed, but it was brief. By adolescence, children were small adults, with adult responsibilities and adult exhaustion. This reduced innovation. Curiosity was beaten out early, which meant society struggled to change. Now let's drift gently toward migration. When things got bad, people moved, rural to urban, urban to rural. Cities swelled suddenly, overcrowding increased, sanitation collapsed, disease flourished. Then cities emptied, economies collapsed. This cycle repeated. Medieval Europe oscillated constantly between growth and collapse, never stable long enough to truly thrive. Extinction hovered not as a single event, but as a possibility that never left. And yet, people married, they loved, they laughed, they built cathedrals that still stand. Human resilience is strange like that. Even while society undermined itself daily, people persisted. They adapted slowly, painfully. In the next part, we drift into one of the most dangerous medieval ideas of all, the belief that suffering made rulers stronger, and that weak rulers were morally suspect. A belief that placed broken people in power, and kept them there. For now, let your breathing slow, let the medieval streets fade, the smoke thinning, the bells growing distant. All right, welcome back, get comfortable again. Let your shoulders sink, your breathing slow. In this part, we're going to stay with one single idea until it's fully, gently exhausted. And once this topic naturally comes to an end, I'll quietly ask you which direction you'd like to drift next. No rushing, no jumping ahead. Now, medieval Europe held one of the most dangerous beliefs a society can adopt. That suffering made you worthy of power, not wisdom, not balance, not competence, pain. The more you endured, the more legitimate you were considered. And this belief placed broken people on thrones, and then refused to let them step down. In the medieval imagination, a ruler was meant to be hardened by discomfort. Illness was a test. Emotional sensitivity was weakness. Mental collapse was something to pray away. If a king admitted he could not cope, he wasn't seen as honest. He was seen as unfit, ungodly, potentially dangerous. So rulers learned very early to hide pain, ignore illness, push through breakdowns, and when they couldn't, everyone pretended they still could. Let's sit with this for a moment. Today, when someone is visibly unwell, we talk about rest, treatment, support. In the Middle Ages, visible suffering was interpreted as divine attention. God was testing them, shaping them, strengthening them, which meant relieving that suffering was, in a strange way, interfering with God's plan. So kings stayed on the throne long after their bodies and minds had quietly collapsed. A calm but unsettling example is King Charles VI of France. He began his reign normally enough, young, promising. Then the episodes began. Sudden rages, long periods of withdrawal, moments where he did not recognize his own wife. At times, he believed he was made of glass, fragile, shatterable. Servants were instructed not to touch him. Metal rods were sewn into his clothing to prevent him from breaking. From a modern perspective, this is unmistakable severe mental illness. From a medieval perspective, this was uncomfortable, but not disqualifying. Charles remained king. He was not replaced. He was not wrested. He was not removed from decision-making. France simply adapted around his illness and fractured. Noble factions fought in his name. Civil conflict grew. Instability spread outward into the lives of ordinary people. One man's untreated suffering became an entire nation's crisis, and this was not an isolated case. Across medieval Europe, rulers ruled while chronically ill, mentally unstable, physically disabled, emotionally overwhelmed. Because stepping aside was not seen as noble, it was seen as cowardice, and cowardice, in medieval culture, was worse than incompetence. This belief affected queens even more harshly. Royal women were expected to endure pain quietly. Repeated pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, physical suffering was considered proof of virtue. If a queen struggled emotionally, she was weak. If she fell into depression, she was ungrateful. If she asked for rest, she was failing her duty. There was no concept of recovery, only endurance. Many queens died young, not from intrigue or poison, but from exhaustion, infection, and bodies pushed far beyond their limits. And yet, their suffering was praised. They were remembered as dutiful, pious, strong, even as their bloodlines quietly thinned. This mindset was passed down deliberately to children. Medieval princes and princesses were not raised gently. Comfort was believed to soften the soul. So children were exposed to cold, disciplined, harshly emotionally distanced from caregivers. Expected to suppress fear and sadness, the intention was resilience. The result was fragile adults with untreated trauma. Many royal children grew up anxious, withdrawn, or volatile. Some died young, others survived, but carried those fractures into adulthood, and into governance. A kingdom ruled by someone raised without emotional security is rarely a stable one. Now, let's touch one last layer of this belief: medicine. Because if suffering was meaningful, then relieving it was morally complicated. Painkillers were rare. Comfort was suspicious. Doctors often avoided easing symptoms too much, fearing they were interfering with divine will. So illness was endured, not treated, which meant diseases progressed further than they needed to. Recovery took longer, deaths increased, but the suffering looked holy, and holiness mattered more than survival. By the late Middle Ages, this belief had quietly done its damage. It kept incapable rulers in power. It exhausted royal women. It traumatized children. It discouraged rest, treatment, and reform. Extinction didn't come suddenly. It crept. Dynasties weakened. Populations thinned. States destabilized. All because pain had been mistaken for proof of worth. Eventually, very slowly, this idea began to soften. Practicality crept in. So did early medical thinking. Not enough to fix everything, but enough to pull Europe back from the edge. And here, this topic gently ends. All right, welcome back. Settle in again. Let your breathing slow, steady, almost forgettable. Tonight, we drift north, away from stone castles and cathedral bells, and into colder air, darker seas, and a universe held together by a tree. This is the Viking cosmos, not loud, not heroic in the modern sense, but strangely tired, fatalistic, and already preparing for its own end, which makes it perfect for sleep. The Norse did not imagine the universe as safe, or orderly, or especially kind. They imagined it as temporary. From the very beginning, everything in Norse mythology is already moving toward collapse. The gods know it, the giants know it. Even the monsters seem aware, they're just waiting their turn. This alone sets the Viking worldview apart. Most religions promise stability, eternity, reward. The Norse offered something quieter. Try your best, die anyway, be remembered, briefly. At the center of everything stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, not a comforting tree, not a peaceful one. A vast ash tree holding all existence, the worlds of gods, humans, giants, elves, the dead, all suspended on its branches. And it is constantly being damaged. A dragon gnaws at its roots, deer eat its leaves, serpents rot it from below. The universe is alive, and slowly decaying. No one fixes this, they just maintain it, barely. There are 9 worlds, but they are not neatly organized. They overlap, they leak into each other. Midgard is ours, the human world, small, vulnerable, surrounded by chaos. Asgard is the realm of the gods, not heaven, just a fortified settlement. Jotunheim is the land of giants, wild, unstable, always pressing inward. And beneath everything lies hell, not fire, not punishment, just cold, fog, stillness, a place for those who died quietly, without glory, without spectacle, which statistically was most people. This cosmic structure shaped Viking psychology deeply. Life was not about avoiding death. Death was assumed. What mattered was how you met it. And even then the reward was limited. Valhalla, the famous warrior hall, was not paradise. It was a barracks. The chosen dead trained every day. They fought, they bled, they healed, they repeated, not for peace, but to die again at Ragnarok. Even the afterlife was temporary. The gods themselves were not eternal. This is crucial. Odin is wise, but anxious. Thor is strong, but easily tricked. Loki is clever, but unstable. None of them are all-powerful. None are safe. They age, they fear, they make mistakes, and they know with absolute certainty that they will die. This knowledge shapes everything. Odin sacrifices an eye for wisdom, not to prevent the end, but to understand it. He hangs himself from Yggdrasil for 9 nights, wounded, starving, alone, not for salvation, but for knowledge that will not save him. This is not a hopeful myth, it is a resigned one. Now let's drift into Ragnarok itself, the final battle, the end of the gods, the collapse of the cosmos. It is not avoidable, it is not postponed, it arrives when the world has grown tired, Brother turns against brother. Moral order decays. Winter lasts too long. Sound familiar? When Ragnar comes, the gods fight anyway. Not because they'll win, but because fighting is what they do. Odin is eaten by the wolf, Fenrir. Thor kills the world's serpent, and dies from its venom moments later. Almost everyone dies. The world burns, then sinks into the sea, and then, quietly, something new emerges. Not triumphant, just continuing. For Vikings, this cosmology made extinction feel acceptable. Not good, not desired, but natural. Civilizations end. Gods die. Worlds collapse. So why should individuals expect permanence? This mindset shaped Viking behavior in subtle ways. They took risks. They valued reputation over survival. They accepted loss with grim practicality. Grief existed, but it was controlled. Death was familiar. This helped them endure harsh environments, cold, famine, violence, but it also limited long-term thinking. Why preserve if everything burns? Even morality was shaped by this worldview. There is no universal good versus evil. Giants are not purely evil. Gods are not purely good. Everyone lies, everyone cheats, everyone survives how they can. Honor matters, but it is situational. Loyalty matters, but only until fate intervenes. This made Viking societies adaptable, but unstable. Feuds lasted generations. Violence escalated quickly. Peace was temporary. Conflict inevitable. Again, extinction hovered. Now, let's talk quietly about fate. The Norse believed in word, a fixed destiny woven by the Norns. Even the gods could not escape it. This belief discouraged prevention. If something bad was coming, it was coming. Preparation mattered. Avoidance did not. So plagues were endured. Disasters accepted. Why fight the inevitable? This stoicism gave strength and passivity. And yet, despite this bleak cosmic vision, the Norse were not joyless. They laughed. They feasted. They told stories. Perhaps because when nothing lasts, moments matter more. This tension between doom and celebration runs through all Norse mythology. It is not loud heroism. It is tired courage. By the time Christianity reached Scandinavia, this worldview softened. The idea of eternal peace was appealing. So was forgiveness. Slowly, the old cosmos faded. Yggdrasil stopped creaking in people's minds. Ragnarok became a story, not a certainty. But the emotional imprint remained. Even today, Norse myths feel heavy, melancholic, quietly resigned. Perfect in a way, for drifting into sleep. Alright, welcome back. Settle in once more. Let the world slow down. Tonight, we're stepping away from gods and myths and into something quieter and far more dangerous. Everyday life. Because for the Vikings, survival was not a heroic moment. It was a daily negotiation with cold, hunger, injury, and time. No drama, just persistence, and occasionally, failure. Let's begin with the Viking home. Most people lived in longhouses, low buildings, thick walls, one main room. Families lived together. Animals lived inside, too, especially in winter, not out of affection, but because shared warmth mattered. The fire burned constantly in the center of the house. Smoke drifted upward, or didn't. There were no chimneys at first, just holes in the roof. So people inhaled smoke daily. Eyes stung. Lungs suffered. By middle age, many Vikings coughed constantly. This was normal. No one commented on it. If you could breathe at all, you were doing well. Now let's drift into food. The Viking diet was practical, not abundant. They ate barley and rye, dried fish, salted meat, porridge, dairy. When available, fresh food was seasonal. Preservation was essential. Salt was precious. Smoking and drying were common. Winter diets were repetitive, nutrient efficient. Scurvy appeared quietly. Weakness, bleeding gums, fatigue. No one knew what caused it. People simply became frail, and frail people did not survive long winters. Now let's talk about water. Vikings drank water, sometimes, but often they drank ale or mead. Not because they were constantly drunk, but because fermentation felt safer. Water sources froze, or became contaminated. Alcohol killed some pathogens. Not enough. but enough to feel reassuring. Children drank diluted ale. Elderly drank it daily. Liver disease existed. No name for it, just decline. Now, let's drift into disease. Vikings did not live isolated lives. They traded, they raided, they traveled. This brought wealth and germs, smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery. These diseases moved through communities isolate. There was no quarantine system, no germ theory. Illness was explained through fate or displeased spirits. People were treated with herbs, charms, and practical care. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. Recovery depended mostly on age, strength, and luck. Let's pause on injuries. Viking life was dangerous even without warfare. Farming injuries, boat accidents, tool mishaps, a deep cut could kill. Infections spread fast. Wounds were cleaned with water or urine. Both were used. Sometimes honey, which actually helped. But if infections set in, there was little to be done. People died from injuries that seem minor today. Now let's drift into childbirth. Viking women were strong, but childbirth was still risky. Midwives used experience, not theory. They knew positioning, comfort techniques, but complications were fatal. Postpartum infections were common. Hemorrhage killed quickly. Infant mortality was high. Families expected loss. Grief was quiet, contained. Children were named after dead relatives. Life continued. Now let's talk about childhood survival. Children worked early, helped with animals, gathered fuel. Exposure built resilience. It also killed the weak. Harsh truth. Society adapted to this, not emotionally but practically. Those who survived childhood were tougher. Those who didn't were mourned briefly. This was not cruelty, it was necessity. Now, let's drift into hygiene. Contrary to myth, Vikings were relatively clean. They bathed weekly, combed hair, cleaned nails, but cleanliness could not stop disease entirely. Parasites existed, lice, fleas. These carried illness. Even clean societies suffered. Now, let's talk about aging. Few Vikings reached old age. Those who did were respected, but aging meant pain, joint damage, tooth loss. Dentistry was basic. Tooth infections could kill. Elders lived with constant discomfort, quietly. Now let's consider survival mindset. Vikings accepted hardship as normal. They planned for scarcity, stored food, shared resources. Communities mattered. Lone individuals died. This communal structure allowed survival in brutal conditions, but it also meant that when systems failed during famine, plague, or climate shifts, entire communities collapsed together. Extinction did not come suddenly. It came winter by winter, and yet, the Vikings endured for centuries. They adapted, migrated, changed. Their resilience was not heroic, it was stubborn. And sometimes, that was enough. All right, welcome back. Get comfortable again. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're drifting into something very quiet, very cold, and very patient. Climate, not as an event, not as a disaster movie, but as a slow pressure that civilizations barely notice, until they can no longer stand. For the Vikings, the world they expanded into was not stable. It only felt that way. When Norse settlers left Scandinavia around the 8th and 9th centuries, they did so during a period of relative warmth, known today as the medieval warm period. Seas were calmer, growing seasons were longer. Ice retreated just enough to make the North Atlantic navigable. This warmth made the Viking world possible. They farmed marginal land, raised livestock in places that barely supported grass, sailed routes that would later become deadly. It worked. For a while, let's drift toward Greenland. When Eric the Red arrived in the late 10th century, Greenland was not green, but it was survivable. Pastures existed. Summer lasted just long enough. Cattle grazed, hay could be stored. Settlements formed. Churches were built. Farms established. A European society planted itself at the edge of habitability. This was not optimism. It was timing. Now, let's talk about what changed. Around the 13th century, global temperatures began to decline, slowly, almost politely. This shift is now known as the Little Ice Age. Winters grew longer, Summers shortened, storms intensified. For societies on the edge of survival, this was catastrophic. But at first, it was subtle. In Greenland, hay yields dropped, livestock starved, malnutrition spread, sea ice blocked trade routes, ships stopped arriving regularly, iron tools broke, wood supplies dwindled. The Norse depended on trade for iron, timber, and grain. Without it, isolation deepened. Now here's the quiet tragedy. The Greenland Norse did not adapt easily. They clung to European farming models, cattle over seals, fields over hunting. Nearby lived the Inuit. They adapted beautifully. They hunted seals efficiently, used kayaks, wore fur clothing suited for extreme cold. The Norse did not adopt these methods, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. Cultural identity mattered more than survival. This is extinction through rigidity. A society so committed to its way of life that it refuses to change, even when change is available, even when neighbors demonstrate a better way. Church records from Greenland grow sparse. Burials show signs of starvation, skeletons with shortened stature, signs of chronic malnutrition. Children grew weaker, adults aged faster. By the 15th century, the Greenland Norse were gone, not conquered, not slaughtered, simply finished. The climate did not kill them quickly. It waited. Now, let's drift back to Scandinavia. The Little Ice Age hit there too. Shorter growing seasons meant repeated crop failures. Famine became more common. Communities migrated. Conflicts increased. The Viking Age itself faded not in battle, but in adaptation. Raiding declined. Settlement patterns changed. Christianity spread partly because it offered structure during uncertainty. Kings centralized power. Local survival strategies disappeared. Society reorganized under pressure. Some adapted, some didn't. Now let's talk about Iceland. Iceland survived where Greenland did not. Why? Flexibility. Icelanders relied heavily on fishing. Marine resources buffered agricultural failure. They adjusted diets, modified settlement patterns. They didn't cling as tightly to continental European farming ideals. Adaptation saved them. The lesson here is not dramatic. Climate did not announce itself. There were no warnings, just colder summers, harsher winters, slightly worse harvests, slightly longer hunger, and then collapse. The Vikings did not understand climate change as a concept. They understood fate. Bad years meant the gods were displeased, or Ragnarok was closer. There was no long-term strategy for gradual decline, only endurance. And endurance alone is not adaptation. This slow collapse mirrors many medieval extinctions. Societies built at the margins, surviving only when conditions were favorable. When those conditions shifted, survival required flexibility. Some societies had it, some didn't. And here, this topic comes gently to rest. Cold settles, fields empty, ships stop arriving. Alright, welcome back. Settle in again. If you're half awake, that's perfect. This part isn't about drama. It's about slow decisions, the kind that don't feel important until everything is gone. Tonight, we're answering a deceptively gentle question. Why did some societies bend, while others simply stopped? No villains, no heroes, just patterns. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. Most societies don't choose collapse. They choose consistency. Consistency feels safe. Adaptation feels like loss. And humans, historically, hate loss more than extinction. Adaptation is social, not individual. One of the biggest myths about survival is that it belongs to the strongest individuals. It doesn't. Adaptation is a collective behavior. A society adapts only when enough people agree change is allowed. Authority tolerates experimentation. Failure is not immediately punished. This is rare. Most medieval societies punished deviation more harshly than stagnation. Trying something new and failing was shameful. Doing the same thing and failing was fate. Identity, the silent killer. Let us return to Greenland again, because it is one of the clearest examples in human history. The Greenland Norse were not ignorant. They were not weak. They were not stupid. They were deeply European. They wore European clothing, built European churches, farmed like Europeans. Even as climate changed, Even as crops failed, even as Inuit neighbors thrived beside them, they held on, because adapting would mean admitting we are not what we thought we were. And for medieval societies, identity was survival. Lose identity, and survival felt meaningless, so they chose dignity over adaptation and quietly disappeared. Flexibility versus pride. Societies that adapted shared one key trait: they tolerated embarrassment. Copying outsiders is humiliating. Changing tradition looks weak. Admitting mistakes threatens authority. Iceland survived because it swallowed its pride. Fishing replaced farming. Diet changed. Settlement patterns adjusted. Greenland did not. Pride fossilized culture. Power structures matter more than intelligence. Highly centralized societies adapt slowly. When permission must travel upward, adaptation arrives late. Kings feared change because change implied past failure. Past failure questioned divine right, so reforms stalled. Local solutions were blocked. Innovation waited for approval that never came. Decentralized communities experimented faster. Some failed, some succeeded. Learning happened. Belief systems. Fate versus responsibility. Belief shapes behavior. Societies that believed suffering was inevitable endured it. Societies that believed suffering was actionable changed conditions. The Norse believed in fate. Medieval Christians often believed in divine testing. Both systems created endurance. Neither encouraged prevention. Endurance keeps you alive in the short term. Adaptation keeps you alive across generations. Trauma freezes societies. This part is often missed. Repeated disaster traumatizes cultures. After enough plagues, famines, and wars, societies stop planning long-term. They become reactive. Short-term survival dominates thinking. Innovation feels risky. Stability, even failing stability, feels safer. Traumatized societies cling to ritual. Ritual creates comfort, but comfort is not resilience. Economic diversity equals survival. This is unglamorous but decisive. Societies with multiple food sources adapt. Farming plus fishing trade plus herding, local plus external supply. Monocultures collapse. Greenland depended on cattle. When cattle failed, nothing replaced them. Iceland had fish. Fish saved Iceland, not heroism. Protein, memory of failure. Societies that survive remember collapse honestly. Societies that fail romanticize the past. Viking culture glorified raiding and bravery, not sustainability. Medieval Europe praised suffering, not prevention. When collapse is mythologized instead of analyzed, it repeats. Inequality and adaptation. This is crucial. Highly unequal societies adapt poorly. When elites hoard resources, innovation stays at the top. Resilience disappears at the bottom. When crisis comes, the base collapses first, then everything above it. Shared survival beats protected privilege. So why did some societies live on? Not because they were smarter, not because they were stronger, but because they were willing to become unrecognizable. Let traditions die. Accept shame, copy others, change stories about themselves. Adaptation is identity death, followed by survival. Many societies could not accept that trade. And here now, this topic is fully, gently complete. No rush, no cliffhanger. Now tell me softly and honestly, all right, welcome back. Settle in again, softly. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your mind drift as though floating down a calm river. Tonight, we explore something very quiet, very human, the mind under pressure. How medieval and Viking societies endured the constant threat of collapse, disease, famine, and death, not as heroes, not as tragedies, but as tired, resilient people. First, let's acknowledge a truth. Pre-modern societies lived under persistent uncertainty. Every season brought risk. Every winter could shorten the next harvest. Every illness could be fatal. Every decision had weight. And yet, life continued. How did people cope? Fate as a mental framework. One of the quietest tools for coping was belief in fate. The Vikings had it in spades. Ragnarok was coming. Fenrir would devour Odin. Humans would die. Some would survive. Most would not. The future was written. You could not change it. You could only act within it. This might sound bleak, but it gave a paradoxical comfort. If collapse was inevitable, if famine, plague, or raid was destiny, then survival was not failure. It was participation. One does what one can. The rest is not on you. Medieval Europeans had a similar framework through religion. Plagues, crop failures, and wars were divine tests. Suffering purified the soul. Prayer was not guaranteed to save you, but it made the world intelligible. Belief in divine oversight created mental scaffolding. It allowed people to explain randomness. It allowed them to endure suffering without succumbing to despair. Community and shared burden. Another coping mechanism was communal life. You were never completely alone. Neighbors, kin, guilds, and village networks shared grief, labor, and knowledge. Children were raised in extended households. Farmers worked side by side. Stories, songs, and rituals bound people together. This created a collective mental resilience. Even when disease struck, or famine struck, humans survived longer as a social unit than alone. Rituals, stories, and symbolism. Humans naturally cope through narrative. Stories framed the world. Rituals framed time. The Vikings had sagas, tales of gods, heroes, and fatal battles. These sagas reminded people that loss and death were expected. Even gods struggled, failed, and died. Medieval Europeans had saints' lives, stories of endurance, martyrdom, punishment that rewarded endurance. In both cases, stories created psychological continuity. You could see your suffering mirrored in myth, and in doing so, make it bearable. The quiet burden of mental strain. But despite these coping strategies, chronic stress left traces. Archaeology shows signs of malnutrition linked to developmental delays, repetitive stress injuries, dental disease from poor nutrition, evidence of chronic illness, and in written records. Despair, melancholy, references to madness and fits of the mind. Mental strain was real, pervasive, and often unaddressed. Coping through routine was a quiet, effective coping strategy. Daily patterns gave people control. Tending animals, milking cows, mending tools, attending services, seasonal festivals, even small certainties, sunrise, tides, prayer created a mental buffer. Predictable patterns reduced anxiety, even when danger was constant. Acceptance of mortality, one of the most striking aspects of pre-modern mental life. People were intimately familiar with death. They held funerals for children. They saw neighbors die frequently. They planned graves alongside homes. Death was neither heroic nor catastrophic, it was ordinary. This created a stoic resilience, a calm expectation, a form of mental preparation that modern life rarely provides. Humor, play, and quiet joy even in collapse. Humans find ways to lighten the burden. Vikings joked. Children played on icy rivers. Medieval festivals combined work and celebration. Humor and play acted as psychological release valves. They reduced tension and prevented despair from becoming paralyzing. The mental lessons of collapse. So what can we observe from all this? Pre-modern societies coped with collapse by accepting fate without surrendering entirely, building strong communal networks, creating rituals, stories, and myths to explain the unpredictable, maintaining routine and predictable tasks, embracing moments of joy amid hardship. These were not heroic. They were pragmatic mental survival strategies. And yet, they were not infallible. Communities that over-relied on fate, ritual, or tradition sometimes failed to adapt practically. They endured mentally, but they could not always endure physically. And here, this topic gently concludes. Mental resilience was real, but it was fragile. Social, cultural, and environmental pressures constantly threatened it. Alright, welcome back for the final part. Settle in completely, dim the lights, let the world outside blur. Tonight, we're drifting gently into the minds and hearts of pre-modern people, their fears, their beliefs, and the ways they made sense of a collapsing world. This is the quiet story of anxiety in history, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent, and oddly, deeply human. Medieval Europe was a world surrounded by uncertainty. Crop failures, plagues, invasions. Every season could bring famine. Every winter could shorten life. For the average person, life felt like balancing on a cliff, constantly shifting beneath them. And religion was the lens through which this instability was understood. The apocalypse was always near. The book of Revelation loomed large in collective imagination. Rivers could dry up. Armies could march. Kings could die unexpectedly. People interpreted these as signs that the end was near, not in a panicked way, but in a constant, low-level expectation of doom. It shaped behavior, charitable giving to avoid divine wrath, pilgrimages to feel closer to God, building relics, shrines, or simple prayer routines. These acts were not just religious, they were mental buffers, ways to reduce anxiety in a world that offered no guarantees. Every disaster had meaning: plague, punishment, famine, divine correction, storms, warnings. Assigning meaning helped people cope. Randomness became intelligible. Death became predictable, even if still terrifying. The structure of belief provided control where control was impossible. Rituals in the calendar. The church structured time carefully. Feasts, fasts, saints' days, and holy weeks created mental scaffolding. Even if winter was brutal, people could count on Easter arriving. Even if crops failed, the ritual rhythm remained. This gave a sense of stability, a soft anchor, a reminder that life had order, even if nature did not. Anxiety and the individual mind. Chronic stress was not a modern invention. People feared the unknown: divine punishment, loss of land, or family. Premature death records show prayers for health, wealth, and mercy. Confessions reveal fear of eternal damnation. Mental strain was constant, but structured within faith. This made anxiety bearable, even if it could not be eliminated. Coping mechanisms across society. Different classes coped differently. Peasants relied on community, ritual, seasonal work. Clergy, interpretation, prophecy, structured prayer. Nobility, fortifications, alliances, symbolic displays of piety. All levels relied on belief systems to explain uncertainty and reduce fear. Even kings, who ruled over armies, feared divine disfavor quietly at night. Apocalypse thinking and social behavior. Belief in the end times affected decisions. Charitable behavior increased. Moral policing became more intense. Stories of saints and martyrs reinforced endurance. People accepted suffering as inevitable because it fit a larger cosmic narrative. This reinforced mental endurance, even if material survival was often fragile. The quiet influence on society. This pervasive anxiety shaped the course of history. It influenced laws, economic practices, and social structures. It encouraged both resilience and rigidity. It protected mental stability, while sometimes preventing practical adaptation. Religion created a mental buffer for collapse. It provided narrative meaning. It allowed people to endure hardship calmly. But it also sometimes froze societies into patterns that made extinction more likely. The takeaway across Europe and the Viking world: pre-modern anxiety was universal. It was constant, chronic, and socially structured. People coped through belief in fate or divine plan, rituals, and predictable calendars, stories, and myths to normalize suffering. Community and shared burden. Even in the face of plague, famine, and climatic disaster, people survived mentally, even if physically their worlds sometimes ended. And now, gently, softly, we arrive at the end of our journey. From suffering kings to collapsing Greenland settlements, from Yggdrasil's branches to the quiet anxieties of medieval peasants, we've drifted through time, across cultures, and inside human minds. History, in its slowest, quietest moments, was never just events. It was endurance, mental, emotional, social, and physical. And through endurance, life continued, sometimes barely, sometimes beautifully. And here, we rest. The story ends. No cliffhangers, No dramatic conclusion, just history and quiet understanding. Now, you can slowly let your mind drift as all the voices of kings, peasants, and gods fade softly into the night.